We're interrupting the ordinary time sequence of events in our church year today to celebrate this feast of the presentation of the Lord. So the colors changed from green to white. Those of you remember Father Juan from our sister parish at the time of San Pedro Yocopilas in Guatemala. He gave me this when I was down there, you can tell. This was not made in Ireland. This is Guatemala. At any rate, what's happening is we're seeing how the story of Jesus and his parents are fulfilling their obligations according to the law of Moses. And I like to remind people that, Jesus never became a Catholic. He was born, raised, and died a Jew. And so we see in today's scripture, this Jewish couple of humble origins are fulfilling their obligations of their religion. It's a twofold obligation. Mary is being brought to the temple to be purified because she's given birth to a child. The woman was considered ritually impure after childbirth because of contamination of blood. He had these strict rules about clean and unclean. And if you gave birth to a boy, 40 days after the birth, you had to go to the temple and get yourself purified. If you gave birth to a girl, it was 80 days after that you went to be purified. Now, I don't know what that says about the difference between boys and girls. Whether or not girls cause you to be more defiled. But at any rate, the boy, so she's there 40 days after. Today, 40 days after Christmas. That was the first part of this ritual. The second is that because he's a firstborn male, according to the law of Moses, he's consecrated to the Lord. And the tradition would have been your firstborn boys are left at the temple to be of service to the priests at the temple. But by that time, the priesthood was pretty well organized according to the tribe of Levi. So any others, they could be redeemed, they could be bought back by offering a sacrifice. And the sacrifice of peasant people would be, as it says, a couple of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons be sacrificed in order to satisfy the obligation that this is a child of the Lord, and you could then take him home, keep him, and raise him. What's interesting is that as the scene takes place, we have these two older folks, Simeon and Anna, who are able to perceive something of God in this child. I like to say that they have spiritual vision based on their own life stories. And I think it's important to acknowledge that sometimes it takes older people who have seen it all over the course of their lives to have a better appreciation of the mystery of how God works with us. And so Simeon and Anna are presented as people who are recognizing the coming of the Messiah. First reading comes from the book of the prophet Malachi. And Malachi was written 450, 460 BC, at a time when the people of Israel were living in their homeland, but not as an independent group, but as a province of the Persian Empire. You might remember they had been living in exile, 587 to 536, whatever it was, BC, under the Babylonians, present-day Iraq. So when the Persians, present-day Iran, when they overpowered the Babylonians, their foreign policy was to allow the Jewish people to go back to their homeland, not as an independent group, but as a province of the Persian Empire. So they were kind of enthused about getting home, and Cyrus the Persian, the Jews saw as an instrument of God, even though he was a pagan, gave them the resources to rebuild their temple. So they went through that process. About 515, they had the temple dedicated, according to Ezra and Nehemiah, and they thought everything was now going to blossom. Well, it didn't blossom very well. So by the time Malachi is writing, 50 years later, 450, 460 BC, The religious rituals have kind of fallen into, how would you say, lax observance. The priests were not diligent in their work, and people were getting discouraged. And so Malachi says, you know, the day of the Lord's coming, and he's going to send a messenger to prepare the way of the Messiah, and that messenger is going to make it such that when the Messiah comes into the temple, he will purify all of you. He will make you get on board to be what it means to be a true son and daughter of Israel. Now, some people thought Malachi was going to be this messenger. Other people said it was Elijah. Christians, of course, think the messenger is John the Baptist, because he's pointing to Jesus as the Messiah. So that's what's going on in the scriptures today, the reference. And they bring the child in. Anna and Simeon perceive this as the child who will make good on the promises of God, to purify their religion, to give them enthusiasm, to make them faithful followers of their traditions as Jewish people. And it's interesting that it's the old people who see this. And as I mentioned earlier, I think there's something to be said about older folks having a spiritual vision which sometimes escapes others. Now, I'm getting older, and my vision's getting worse, personally. You know, when you go to the restaurant and you got to read the fine print, now they must make those menus in fine print now. It's very hard to read. Or when you're driving at night and you get the flashing of the headlights because you got those beginning of cataracts. How many have had that problem? I know I have, yes. But these older folks have better vision. It's not physical vision, it's spiritual vision. And I think that that's based on their experience. It says they were pious and devout. And they spent lots of time in prayer. But you see, for them, religious exercises were not an end to themselves. See how many times you could do these rituals. But rather, they used them as a way of purifying their own hearts and developing a sense of the presence of God in their lives. And that makes all the difference. And sometimes it takes a lifetime to perfect that. I have to say that I've been blessed with some good mentors, older folks. I was ordained in 73, and it was the same year that my role model for being a priest, Father Tom Tour, was celebrating his 50th anniversary. Father Tour was the only priest I knew growing up. Grew up in St. Jude's in Winenskill, went through 8 grades in the school, 4 years of Catholic High, and he was the only priest I knew as a parish priest. And I think it was based on his example that I decided I'm going to try to be a priest. But it's funny because the year I got out of high school, he decided to leave St. Jude's and to go back to his home parish, which was St. Joseph's in Arbor Hill in Albany. Now, when he left 50 years earlier, it was an Irish and Polish and Italian neighborhood. By the time 50 years later he goes back in 65, that's all filled with black Irish, you might say. And it was a challenging time in the mid-60s for inner-city parishes. But the Father Tour, what he did when he went there, he established the ritual of when he went out for his daily walk. He didn't go during the day. He would go out like 9 o'clock at night to make sure that people realized he was not afraid of the neighborhood. He was not afraid of people who were not part of his parish. And he made it self-evident that the love of the church there was for everybody. And he did that consistently. And I kind of picked up on that because my first assignment in 73 was St. Vincent's. I stayed there about 15 months. Then I went to Arbor Hill. By that time, Father Tour was retired, but he was still living in the neighborhood. And I learned a lot from him about perceiving the movement of God in places you might least expect. After about 3 or 4 years, I got moved down to St. John's in the South End. Father Peter Young, who was a great advocate for poor people in the in our diocese in Albany got inflicted with some problems with his legs and was losing his mobility. He had to give up the church because they had a lot of steps. So I called into the office and I said, there's only 2 of us here in St. Joe's, myself and Frank O'Connor. If you need somebody to cover St. John's till you get a pastor, I'm willing to go down there and help out. So 2 days later, I get a call from Bishop Broderick. And he says, I understand you're not opposed to taking on some responsibility in the South End. I says, yeah. Well, I want you to be the pastor. I was 29 years old, 3 years ordained, limited experience. But I was asked to be the pastor of this dynamic inner-city parish. They had services from womb to tomb, from daycare to cemetery, alcohol program, employment counseling, thrift shop, RCIA, which was a new thing in those days. And we did some wonderful things. One of the things that happened, though, there was an older priest who had been the pastor of St. Anne's years before. He was still living in the rectory. And his name was John Feary. And he wanted to stay in the rectory. He probably should have gone to a facility, a healthcare facility, but he wanted to stay. So we hired a girl from Arbor House to come in and get him going in the morning. And he was able to stay with us. We had meals probably 3 nights a week. We'd sit and talk about stuff. And I learned so much from his vision. Because he would say to me, Tommy, don't worry about that chancery. Worry about taking care of your people. Make sure that they know the doors of this place are open. Even to the point where a school, which by that time was filled with 90% non-Catholic inner city kids, he wanted to keep it open. The diocese wanted to charge tuition and make sure it was viable. So he got in trouble with the bishop over that one. But he also got Dan O'Connell, who was the old Democratic boss in the South End. For those of you who remember Albany politics, he got Dan to subsidize the place for about 3 or 4 years to keep it going. Vision to do the right thing. And when I remember it was Labor Day weekend, and I had told Doreen not to bother coming in because I'll get Father Ferry going in the morning. So I go in to wake him up, he's dead. Now what do I do? I was going to go to the lake. It was Labor Day weekend, So anyway, we had made arrangements with him about a month earlier, what he wanted for his funeral. So for his funeral, he wanted to have Precious Lord Take My Hand. And I remember that we put that music program together, and about a week later I was talking to this older woman in the parish, and she said, oh, Father Ferry's funeral was so beautiful, but it was so sad. When you sang Precious Lord Take My Hand, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. She says, I'll tell you what, when I die, I want to have, take me out to the ball game and get me to the church on time. That's another example of senior wisdom. As time went on, I got moved around. I wound up here. And I met a woman here in this parish who taught me a lot. She stopped me one day and says, I think I'd like to join your parish. Will you, I said, well, what I do is set up a time, we sit down and talk, what you want to, any questions you have, and you want to have envelopes or not, all that stuff. So we had a little appointment, and she told me her story. She said, I'm not too sure if you're going to have me. I said, well, let's see. So anyway, she told me the story. Earlier in her life, she had been a sister, a nun, daughter of charity, for like 28 years. But in the late 60s, when everything was in turmoil, things were going on, she decided to leave the convent. And she went on her own. She had to go back to school. She got some education and administration. She wound up, working hard, and actually she became a physician at Harlem Hospital in New York City. And after about 3 or 4 years, maybe 5, she met a fellow who was a widower and seemed to be the right match, and they got married. They were married about 30 years, and then he died. And so she decided she'd come up this way because she had family in the area, and she had a place over at Colbert Village. She said, "But I gotta tell you," she says, when my husband died, it was a big change because while we were together, we kind of walked away from church. I didn't feel the need to go to church because I had that intimacy with my husband. And intimacy was defined as being naked, being vulnerable with another person, and still feeling safe. I think that's a good definition. Intimacy. She said, I had that with my husband, but when he died, I had like a hole in my soul. So one thing led to another, and I kind of wandered back here at this church. And I'd like to say that I found intimacy with the Lord in the Eucharist because I was vulnerable there, but I still felt safe. I thought to myself, I'm going to ask this woman to be my spiritual director because it's true. Sometimes people have so much wisdom that they might be reticent to share. But that's the way I think the Spirit of God works in our communities. Whether you're old or young, rich or poor, male or female, black or white, whatever, everybody has the option of allowing the Spirit to fill them with wisdom. And thank God I've had people like that in my life. And I'm sure you have too. So it's important to acknowledge that. It's important to acknowledge that, just like Anna and Simeon in today's scripture, who had that vision of faith that came from their lifelong experience of prayer. And the prayer wasn't just religious activities in order to score points with God, but their religious devotions led them to an intimacy with this God who continues to desire to be close to us. So, think about it. Be grateful for those who've touched your life, and don't be afraid to share your faith, because with that, you can deal with anything that comes down the pike, and that is really a blessing. Let us stand and profess our faith.